We continue now at the top of Daf Chafala from Aleph from Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 21a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing the case of Zenene V'Zelo Chaser. The case specifically is, let's say a person lives in the Chaser of his friend without that person's knowledge and he's getting benefit, but the person who owns the Chaser is not losing anything. So does he have to pay rent or does he not have to pay rent? And the Gemara said that Rabbi Avo said from Rabbi Yochanan that Sarach Lahalos Lo Schar, that he does have to pay rent. And the Gemara was commenting that Rabbi Avo did not hear that directly from Rabbi Yochanan, but he inferred it from Rabbi Yochanan's response to something that he said. And what he said was, it was in the context of a Mishnah in Me'ilah. The Mishnah in Me'ilah says that if you have a Evan, a stone, or a Korah, a crossbeam of Hektish, and then you put that on the top of your skylight, and you live underneath it so you get benefit, so that's considered to be Me'ilah. That is the misuse of Hektish. And Rabbi Avo quoted Shmuel and said, this shows that exactly our case, that if somebody lives in the chutzner of his friend Shalom Idaita without his knowledge, so then Tzarech Lahalos Lo Schar, he has to pay rent. And that's why, since just like he has to pay rent, so too when he's going to live under it, that's going to be considered to be Me'ilah. And when Rabbi Avo quoted that from Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan was silent, and so Rabbi Avo inferred from Rabbi Yochanan that he agrees that you have to pay the rent. Zenene V'Zelo Chaser is going to be chayiv. But then the Gemara said it's not true. Really, Rabbi Yochanan thought the comparison made no sense at all, and that's why he was quiet. He was silent because it didn't make any sense. And why did it not make any sense? The Gemara explains, because when you have hektish shelo midas, when let's say the Beis HaMikdash doesn't know what you're doing, like the case of Hadar b'Chatzar Chavero shelo midaito, but that's kehediot midas dami, that's the same thing as a regular person who does know what's going on. And Tosas here explains, quotes Rashi from the previous Amud, kehediot midas dami, perish hakuntris the das shchina ika. Rashi explains that the shchina always knows what's going on, meaning the case of Hadar b'Chatzar Chavero shelo midaito, if a person lives in the Chatzar of his friend without that person's knowledge, that's the case of Zenene V'Zelo Chaser. But when it comes to the situation of Hektish of Me'ilah, so there the Shechina always knows, HaKadosh Baruch Hu always knows what's happening. It's never Shalom Idaito, and that's why in that case, of course, it's going to be Me'ilah. Now, Tosas point out, V'kasha, but this is a difficult explanation. The Shalom Idaito lav dafka, because the question of Zenene V'Zelo Chaser doesn't really matter whether the person is aware of the fact that you're in the Chaser, or he's not aware of the fact that you're in his Chaser. That's not the issue. That's just a normal case. The normal situation is that the case of Zenene V'Zelo Chaser is usually when he's living in the person's Chaser or in the person's house, and the person is not aware, he's getting benefit, and the person is not losing anything. But the same would be true if the person was aware. You'd have the same shaila of Zenene V'Zelo Chaser. So in other words, the point is, who cares about the fact that the Shechina always knows what's going on, and therefore that's the same as Midas, but Midas doesn't change the nature of the question. And so Tosas changed it slightly. Elanira, rather, it appears to explain as follows: Kehedyot midas dami. What it means when we say that hektish shalom midas is like hedyot midas, kilomar dedas shchina ika. What it means is that the shchina is aware, shelo yena adam below me'ilah. Meaning to say, the understanding of the shchina is that nobody should get benefit from hektish without it being considered to be me'ilah. That's just a rule when it comes to hektish, that's considered me'ilah and has no bearing on the question of Zenene V'Zelo Chaser. And the Gemara continues, Sholach le Rabbi Abba bar Zavda lemori bar Mar. Rabbi Abba bar Zavda sent the following message to Mori bar Mar. Boy minei me Rav Huna, ask from Rav Huna the following question: Hadar b'chatzar chavera shalom idaito. Again, if a person lives in the chatzar of his friend without his knowledge, tzarech lahalos lo scharo lo, do you have to pay the rent or not? Again, in the case of Zenene V'Zelo Chaser, is he chayiv or not? In the meantime, Rav Huna died. He couldn't ask the question from Rav Huna. Amar le Rabba bar Rav Huna. So Rabba, the son of Rav Huna, he said, Hachi Amar Abba Mori Mishmei de Rav. So says father, my master, in the name of Rav, as follows: Eino tzarech la'alos lo schar. He doesn't need to pay the rent in that case. He is not chayiv. And Rabba bar Rav Huna continued further, V'hasocher bayis me Ruvain, somebody who rents a house from Ruvain, malas schar l'Shimon. He does pay the rent to Shimon. The Gemara says, what does that even mean? Shimon ma'avidite. What is Shimon doing over here? He's renting the house from Ruvain. Why is he paying the rent to Shimon? And the Gemara says, no, hachi kamar. This is what the second statement means. Nimtza habayis shel Shimon. If it turns out that it wasn't really Ruvain's house, it was actually Shimon's house, mala lo schar, then he has to pay the rent. But the Gemara asks Tarti, that seems to be a contradiction between the two statements. In the first statement, we're saying Zenene V'Zelo Chaser, he doesn't have to pay the rent. And now we're saying he lives in Shimon's house. It seems to be Zenene V'Zelo Chaser, and he does have to pay the rent. The Gemara says that's not a difficulty. Had the kaima le'igra. In one case, we're talking about where Shimon was going to rent it out to somebody else, and so therefore it's a case of zenena v'zeh chaser. This person is benefiting, and the other person actually is losing out. That's when you have to pay the rent. Had lo kaima le'igra. But in the other case, we're talking about where it was not meant to be rented out. He wasn't losing anything. Zenena v'zeh lo chaser is not going to be chayiv. And the Gemara continues, Itmar Nami, Amar Rav Chia bar Avin, Amar Rav. It was stated as well, Rav Chia bar Avin said that Rav said, V'amri lo, and some have the version as follows, Amar Rav Chia bar Avin, Amar Rav Huna. That Rav Chia bar Avin said that Rav Huna said, Hadar b'chatzar chaver shalom idaito, einot tzarech l'halos lo schar. If he lives in the chatzar of his friend without his knowledge, he does not need to pay the rent. V'hasocher bayis mibnei ho'ir, and if somebody rents a house from the people of the city, ma'ales schar l'bailim, he has to give the schar, the rent, to the owners. Again, the Gemara asks, Bailim ma'avidatai, what owners are we talking about over here? Hachikamar, this is what it means to say, Nimsu lo bailim, if it's found that it has owners, Malin lahem schar, again he has to pay the rent. The Gemara again asks, Tarti, isn't that a contradiction between the two statements? And the Gemara answers the same as above, Had the kaima la'agra, had the lo kaima li'agra. In one case we're talking where it was going to be rented to someone else, it's actually a case of zenene v'zeh chaser, then you do have to pay, but if it wasn't going to be rented, so then there's no loss, zenene v'zeh lo chaser is not going to be chayiv. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Schora, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. Rav Schora says that Rav Huna says that Rav says, Hadar b'chatzar chaver shalom idaito. If somebody lives in the courtyard of his friend without his knowledge, ein tzarech lahalos lo schar, he does not need to pay him any rent, mishum shenemar, because the pasuk says, Hu she'iyah yukas shar. And Rashi explains, Shenamar She'iyah Yukas Shar means to say shade, that refers to a demon. Sheshmo She'iyah, the name of the demon is She'iyah, Mekates Shar Bayis, so he causes the gate of the house to be destroyed. Shein b'nei adam darn, but when people don't live in it, meaning when you have a desolate house, it gets destroyed. So therefore, a person who lives in the house is actually doing a favor. He's making sure that the house doesn't get destroyed. Desolation causes destruction. Another version of understanding the pasuk, bayis shushoy v'yachid, the same basic idea, but a house that again is desolate, me'ein adam, no one's there, yukas shar mazikin mekatatin also, again, so then the gate is going to be struck. The demons, the mazik and the damagers are going to destroy it, and therefore, again, the person is actually doing the owner a favor and does not have to pay the rent. And the Gemara continues, Amar Mar bar Ravashi said, L'didi chazile, I saw such a desolate kind of house, umanagach kitura, it looked like it was gored by an ox. And the Gemara continues along the same lines, Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yosef says, Beisa Meisva Yosef, if you have a house that is settled, so then that house is able to stay in good shape. And Rashi explains, Beisa Meisva Yosef, Bayis Shul Miyusha B'diras B'nai Adam, if people are living in a house, so Yosef Yashuvu Kayim means to say, then the house will be maintained. L'fisha Hadarn B'socha, because those who live inside it, Roan Mashu Tzarech, they realize what needs to be done, U'Mesakrin also, and they fix it, and therefore the same idea, again, essentially the person living in the house is doing a favor. The Gemara says, Mai Beinayo, so what's the difference between the two explanations? It seems to be similar explanations. The Gemara says, Ika Beinayo, the difference is, let's say you have a house that no one is living in, no people are living in, but it is being used, they're putting inside wood and straw. As Rashi says, the Balabayas stores his wood and his straw there, and this person goes and lives there, so in terms of desolation, it's not desolate. That house was being used, and so therefore the person is doing no favors. According to that explanation, he still may have to pay rent. However, Mishum Beisa Meis Va'ika, but in terms of the idea that people are living there, so then he is doing a favor, the person going there. De'ein Ze Yishav, no one's actually living there. There's just some wood, there's just some straw there. And this person who lived there, he actually did a good thing and helped out, so that's the difference between the two explanations. And the Gemara continues, there was a person who built a mansion on the garbage heap that belonged to the Yisomim, to the orphans. So Rav Nachman, he took away the person's mansion because it wasn't on his property. The Gemara says, Leimo Kasav Rav Nachman, should we say based on this that Rav Nachman holds that if a person lives in the courtyard of his friend without his knowledge, he has to pay rent? It's exactly this case. It's a case of Zen and Chaser. Apparently, he took away the mansion. Apparently, he has to pay rent in that case. And the Gemara says not necessarily Ahume Kara Karmenoi have a diary bay over there. In that situation, the Karmenoi, Rashi says that's the name of a certain kind of people, they were living there. V'yahavi luhuli yasmi davar mud, and they actually did pay the Yisomim. They paid the orphans a little bit for using that property, and therefore it is a situation of chaser. The Yisomim actually were losing out because they could have collected a little. So Amar le zil paisinu liyasmi, so he told the person who built the mansion, go give the orphans something because they're losing out. V'lo ashkach, and the person didn't pay attention, and so therefore Agver Rav Nachman la'afadne minei. Therefore, Rav Nachman took away the mansion from him. And Rashi explains, Karmenoi Shem Uma. Again, the Karmenoi is the name of a certain nationality. Rashi has another explanation, Lishna Achrina Kadmonoi. It means the early people. Meaning Kadmonim Shayu Yoshim Bo, the people who lived there earlier, Umalim Schar Yisomim, they paid a little bit to the Yisomim. V'havale Kaimal Agra. Therefore, it's a situation where it was standing to be rented, and therefore they were losing, and that's why in this situation he took away the mansion. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Keitzad Mishalemis Mashenenis V'chulu. In what case do you pay the benefit, and in what case do you pay the damages? So the Mishnah made a distinction. The Mishnah said if the animal eats right in the middle of the street, that's Rosh Hashanah, so then potter on damages, because Shein and Rosh Hashanah is potter, but you still have to pay the benefit that the animal derived from that eating. But let's say eats from the side of the street, which is not considered to be Rosh Hashanah, so then you have to pay the full damage. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav says, Uve Mechazeres. The case where you have to pay the full damage is where the animal turns its head and eats out of the side area of the streets. Shmuel Amar, but Shmuel says, Afilu Mechazeres Nami Potter. It's not true, even if the animal turns its head, but since its whole body is in the Rosh Hashanah, it's still going to be Potter. That's still considered Shein in Rosh Hashanah. And the Gemara says, Shmuel Hechim Ashkachas Lo Demechayev. Well, according to Shmuel, where will you be obligated to pay for the damages? Kagon Deshavakta L'Rechava V'Yazlo V'Kamma B'Tzid Rechava. Only in a situation where the animal actually leaves the middle of the street and goes and its whole body stands at the side of the street, that's considered Tzidei Rechava. That's not considered Rosh Hashanah, and then you pay the full amount. And the Gemara continues, Vika demasni la shmaita bape nafsha. Some people learn this not on the Mishnah, but just a machlokas independent between Rav and Shmuel. Mechazeres, in a situation where an animal turns its head, but the body is still in the main part of the street, but turns its head to the side of the street. Rav Amar chayeves. Rav says in that case you're chayev to pay the full damages from what is eaten. Shmuel Amar patura. And Shmuel says patra. Shmuel says exempt. Shmuel mishalemes mashehizika hechim ashkachasla. And so again, the Gemara asks, according to Shmuel, when do we find a situation where you pay the amount of the damage to mechayva? Where do you find that you're chayiv to pay? That would be a case where, again, the animal leaves the middle of the street, actually goes and stands at the side of the street. Then you're going to have to pay the full amount of the damages. And the Gemara continues, Mesiv Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak asks, Mi Pesach hachanus meshalemes mashenenis. It says that if the animal eats from the opening, from the entryway of the store, so then you have to pay the amount of the benefit that was derived. You don't have to pay the damages. And so the Gemara says, Heichim mashkachasla. So what exactly is the case over here, where the animal is eating from the entryway, by the entryway of the store? Pshita b'mechazeres. It obviously is a case where it's mechazeres. The animal turns its head and eats by the front of the store. The kamer mashenenis. And what does it say? It says that you only have to pay. The Mishnah says you only have to pay the amount of benefit that was derived. Mashenenis in mashehizikolo. You only pay the benefit. You don't have to pay what was damaged. And so therefore it seems like what Shmuel says, that by a case of mechazeres is potter. And the Gemara says, Hu mosiv lavu mefarakla. He asked the question. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak asked the question, and he answered the question as follows: Dekaima bekeren zavis. The case over here is, the reason why you're potter is because it was actually at the corner, as we see in the diagram over here. You have a mavoi gadol, you have a large mavoi, a large alleyway, and you have a smaller alleyway, and the store was right there jutting out from the corner, and so therefore it actually was right as the animal was walking. From the animal's perspective, the animal is just in the middle of the street and walks right in by the Pesach HaChanus, by the entryway of the store. So that's why in that situation, that's basically Rosh Hashanah, that's fully Rosh Hashanah, and you're going to be potter. You're not going to have to pay the damages. Now, if you have a normal situation where it's one size of the street is one size the whole way, and the chanus, the store, is at the side, then it's turning its head, that might be a different story. And the Gemara continues, Zika Diamri, there are those who have another version of the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. Mechazeres kuli amalo pligi. According to this version, nobody argues when it comes to mechazeres, when it comes to a case where the animal turns its head, the chayeves, certainly in that situation, it's not considered to be Rosh Hashanah, and the owner is going to be chayev to pay for the damages. Ki pligi, when is there a machlokas between Rav and Shmuel? That's when a person withdraws from his own property, and he essentially gives over some of his property to the Rosh Hashanah. As Rashi explains, he withdraws his property, and he builds over there, but he builds a little bit back, so part of his land is now essentially part of the Rosh Hashanah. And he puts fruits on what is really his property, but that property right now appears to be the Rosh Hashanah. And then an animal is just walking, and as it's walking, it eats that fruit. That's going to be the machlokas Rav and Shmuel. And the Gemara continues, V'achi Itmar, and the machlokas is as follows. Amar Rav says, Lo shanu ela mechazeres, that we only say chayiv in a situation, a classic situation where the animal turns its head. Aval mekatza makom irashusal irashus Ravim betura. But if you have a case where a person actually takes his property and essentially he withdraws from his property and gives his property over to the Rishus Ravim, that's already like a Rishus Ravim, and in that case the owner of the animal is going to be exempt. Ushmuel Amar, but Shmuel says no, afilu mekatza makom irashusal irashus Ravim, even in a situation where a person withdraws his property and therefore part of his property is as if it's joined with the Rishus Ravim, but really it's not Rishus Ravim, really it's Rishus Hayochid, and Chayevis, we're going to say in that situation that the owner of the animal is going to be Chayev. And the Gemara says, Leima bebor b'reshuso kamiflagi. Let us suggest that maybe this machlokus, Rav and Shmuel, is actually a machlokus about bor b'reshuso. Let's say a person digs a pit, but that pit is in his own property. Rav do amar potter. Rav says Rav who says that in the case of mekatza makom is potter, kasavar bor b'reshuso chayev. He'll hold that bor b'reshuso is chayev. Shmuel do amar chayev, and Shmuel who says chayev, kasavar bor b'reshuso potter. He's going to hold that bor b'reshuso is potter. Let us suggest that. Rashi explains as follows. Lema Rav Shmuel bechofer bor b'reshuso. The case would be as follows. Let's say a person digs a pit in his own property, vehifkir reshuso, and then the person makes his property ownerless, velo hifkir bora, but he doesn't make the pit ownerless. So kamiflagi, maybe that's exactly the same machlokas. He's essentially making his property ownerless, like this case of mekatza makom. Uveplugsa Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Akiva depligi Bava Kamma. This is a machlokas tanoim between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva later on. The Rav says in that situation where he makes his property ownerless, he's chayiv. So if you're going to say that the person is chayiv in that case of bor b'reshuso, so from the same logic we're going to say that the animal who eats from the fruit is going to be potter in that case. Because the person who puts his fruits there, that's basically like a pit. And if the behema would slip on that fruit, we would say chayiv. That's the idea, again, that Rav holds chayiv by bor b'reshuso. The reason why it's chayiv is because he made his rishus, he made his property ownerless. He essentially made it like a rishus Ravim. Hilkach lo hayalo lasos kain. Therefore, he shouldn't have done that. That if something causes damage in rishus Ravim is chayiv. And anyone who wants to take possession of those items is allowed to take possession. So, in other words, Rav who says that in this situation we're going to say potter, in the case of mekatza makom rishus Ravim is petura. The idea is, why is it potter in that situation? Why is the owner of the animal potter? Because the person really essentially turned this area into Rishus Ravim totally. It's like a Rishus Ravim, and therefore since he turned the area in Rishus Ravim, if he would put a bor there, he would actually be responsible. It's as if he's placed a bor in Rishus Ravim. He's not supposed to do that, and so on the same count, the animal is not going to be, the owner of the animal is not going to be chayiv for eating the fruit. Shmuel savar potter, and Shmuel says potter in the case of bor b'reshuso. Helgach behema shachalt and chayeves, and therefore, if you're going to be potter in that case, it's considered like your own property. It's not a problem of a bor b'reshus haravim when it's a bor b'reshuso. So if the animal eats from their chayev, sharei b'reshus also, because in this situation, what he did with permission. It was really his property. Reshus haravim nami lo have shein zederech hilucha. This is not really reshus haravim either, because this is not the normal way of walking, and so therefore again, Shmuel is going to hold potter by the case of bor b'reshuso, and that's why if the animal eats from that fruit, we're going to say the owner of the animal is chayiv. And the Gemara continues, Amar lach Rav will respond to you, no, really I can say to you, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis.